What's up, everybody? Welcome to the definitive Week 6 NFL cash game breakdown. My name is Ben Hauver. Today, I will be going over every player that I deem to be cash game viable on DraftKings in Week 6. Today, I have got a pretty concise player pool. I think one of the smaller pools I've analyzed in this video series, especially when we look at running back and wide receiver. I do think that this is an interesting slate from sort of a general overview perspective. I am recording this video early on Thursday morning. Okay, so I do think that there are a couple of key injuries that we don't have all the information on yet. So, just to remind people and inform new viewers as well, I do update these tiers every Sunday morning. They will be posted for free on my Twitter account at Ben Hauver. So you can see how to spell that in the bottom of the screen. So just make sure you follow me there and keep up to date on any changes that I make to these tiers by Sunday morning. If you think that I'm missing somebody who's cash viable, or you disagree with these tiers, or have any questions, anything like that, just hit me up on Twitter. I'll be pretty quick to respond, no doubt about it. But let's get right into these tiers, starting with quarterbacks. So my top tier consists of one gentleman. His name is Lamar Jackson. Now, Lamar to me is a really standout play. So, he's coming off of not a great game, but going back home to face this Bengals defense that is absolutely terrible. They're bottom 5 in sacks, they're bottom 5 in QB hits, and they are top 3 in rushing yards allowed to quarterback. The Ravens have the highest implied team total on the slate with 29.5. We could even see that rise, I think, by the time Sunday rolls around. Lamar, he's 6,900, so he's not cheap. He's the second most expensive quarterback on the slate, above Watson, below Mahomes. I just think that this lines up perfectly for Lamar. Like we said, there's very little pressure being generated by the Bengals up to this point, and the rushing floor we know with Lamar is high. He should face a clean pocket, so maybe a high passing floor as well, and everything about Lamar is just a smash play. Let's move on to the second tier here, because this, I think, might be the tier that most people are playing from once we bring lineup construction and price into things, despite Lamar being only 200 more than Watson, only 500 more than Ryan. This is a tight slate, so I think that salary savings, even of only 500, is going to be prevalent, especially at quarterback, where we're always more willing to sacrifice for a comparable option. So Watson to me is an interesting play. He is not the most consistent guy on this list, not by any stretch. When you look at the way Watson has been performing this year, he's been boomer bust, and I think that that's kind of the player he is. His workload is consistent between 29 and 34 pass attempts in every single game, between 3 and 7 rush attempts, so he's got a slight rushing floor. But what's really concerning with Watson is he has 2 games without a passing touchdown. Now, in those games, he did have a rushing touchdown in each, so he isn't drawing dead. But still, you don't want to see, that as a possibility, On the other hand, like I said, boom or bust. So the bust is obviously there. But with the boom, he has, in any game that he has thrown a touchdown, he's thrown at least 3. Week 1, 3 touchdowns. Week 3, 3 touchdowns. Last week against Atlanta, 5 touchdowns, over 40 points on DraftKings, as I'm sure everybody knows. So, now he is on the road, which, doesn't really worry me with Watson, and he's going to be facing the Chiefs in a game that should, no doubt about it, just be an absolute, shootout. So I do think that Watson is an upside play in terms of cash. I think that he might have the highest ceiling out of any of these guys, save Mahomes, but Mahomes is too expensive this week, in my opinion, for cash games. But, I don't know. I think that Watson has a legit shot to get, in the plus 35 point range again this week. And that's what you would be paying for at 6,700. I don't know that I would go there. If I'm all the way up to 6,700, there's got to be somewhere to find that 200 to get up to Lamar, I think. But Matt Ryan, 6,400. He has gone 5 straight games with at least 300 yards passing. Last week against the Texans, a 35-point game. So Ryan has been absolutely consistent. His home road splits are not as devastating as they've been in the past. Arizona is a dome, retractable roof if I'm not mistaken, but a dome nonetheless. And Ryan has been just absolutely consistent, securing that 300-yard bonus, like I said, in every game so far this season. Only one game under 20 points, and that was a 19.68-point game. Everything else has been above 23 points or more. He's got that 35-point ceiling, as we saw last week, and as has been the case in almost every matchup that Arizona has played, we can expect a increase in pace of play in this game. So I think that Ryan at 6,400, played him last week. He was incredibly cheap. I think that this price is a little bit better for him, but still, with as consistent as he's been, he's squarely in play for cash. I think that he might be my lean, honestly, at this point. At 6,200, we've got Dak Prescott, who's been wildly consistent, 28 points or more in 3 of his 5 games up to this point, even in a game where the Cowboys struggle immensely, which I don't expect to be the case this week. You look at last week where Dak threw 3 interceptions. I mean, he just piled up a ton of yardage, though. 463 yards passing, 2 touchdowns, about 30 yards on the ground. And yeah, Prescott has been impressive, and now he's facing a terrible defense, a complete pass funnel, on the road against the Jets. So I think that Dak is in a prime bounce back spot, and at 6,200, you're getting a significant, price discount, $700 from Lamar Jackson. So I do think that he is also squarely in play if you don't feel like, sort of going in the middle there with Ryan. And then the last guy I'm considering for cash games is Kyler Murray. Now, the reason that he is below everybody else in this tier is I just don't know yet if he has 30-point upside. And while his floor is very secure, which is why I do think he's squarely in play, and the Falcons are abysmal, as we've seen. Their defense is horrific, and we know pace of play will be high in this game, as I said a couple minutes ago. But I don't know. I mean, we're talking about a guy with 4 touchdowns passing through 4 weeks. I don't know. He's got 3 games with zero touchdowns. Throwing at least. And I don't know. It's tough to play a guy like that, I think. He's more expensive than Matt Ryan. Would I play him over Matt Ryan? I don't think so. But I mean, I do think we could see a ceiling game. Even as I'm talking about this, I'm starting to think that Murray is more exclusively a GPP play in the hope that we finally do see a ceiling game from him this week. I don't know that I could justify playing him over any of the other 4 guys listed. So looking at running backs, there are 2 clear plays in the top tier for me, and that is Alvin Kamara and Dalvin Cook. Now, if I'm going to pick one of these guys, and when I look at lineup construction, there are wide receivers that I want to pay up for. I don't think that we're getting a bottom-of-the-barrel quarterback this week, so we have to pay up a little bit there. And there is not that much value, to be honest, at least at this point in the week. So I do think that it's likely that you're only going to be able to jam in one of these 2 guys in terms of a cash game lineup construction. So for me, I think it's Kamara, and I'll explain why. So Kamara is, only 1 game out of 5 up to this point with under 20 touches. He's been extremely consistent when you look at his usage. He's got only 2 touchdowns through 5 games, which, a lot of the time we think about, Kamara as, at least in the past, as a guy who might regress his touchdown rate. Well, we've seen it. His touchdown rate is regressing, probably, very likely in part, at least due to the fact that there was a significant quarterback downgrade from Breeze to Bridgewater, despite Bridgewater's big game last week. I think if you consider his usage and his talent, Kamara is bound for one of these massive games, and what better spot to target, than against Jacksonville, who surrendered over 200 yards to Christian McCaffrey last week and 3 touchdowns combined. So I do think that, Kamara is in a absolute smash spot. You get $400 discount from going down off of Dalvin Cook. And I don't want to shade Dalvin Cook at all. He's been by far one of the most consistent players in the NFL, one of the most consistent running backs that you could play in fantasy. He should be fine. Despite this tough matchup, he's still playing at home. Okay. And the Eagles, they have a great defense. I'm not gonna disrespect them, but they have been giving up quite a few, receptions to running backs, and Dalvin Cook surprisingly is second on the Vikings in targets. He's being targeted more than Stephon Diggs. I mean, we know that there's a situation there with Diggs, but As far as that goes, I mean, I think that Dalvin Cook's floor is still extremely high. I do just like the potential ceiling, I think, in Alvin Kamara. Between these two guys, I would not, be offended by anybody playing either of these guys in cash. They're lock and load options. Now, tier 2, player 3 for me here is Le'Veon Bell. Now, Le'Veon at 6,400 stood out the second I looked at this slate. He's averaging 24.5 touches per game. He is top 5 in the NFL in running back targets, and his efficiency has been poor, but I don't really put that on him, to be honest. It's been just a terrible offense, and I'm willing to throw out, the poor efficiency when we were talking about Luke Falk. Now, Sam Darnold, is he Patrick Mahomes? No. But is he better than Luke Falk? Who isn't? Okay, Falk has been by far the worst quarterback in the league. Le'Veon Bell at 6,400 again with that receiving floor. And just last week we saw Dallas at home get torched for 4 touchdowns. Now Lev only has 1 touchdown on the year up to this point. I think that he could definitely have a higher touchdown expectation this week with Darnold back, with the team finally looking a little bit healthier on offense. And at 6,400, just the floor, especially with the receiving, is too high for me to ignore. I do think that Le'Veon Bell, price considered, will probably be, the number 1 owned running back. Maybe not. Some ownership projections don't totally agree with that, but I think he should be, and I will almost certainly be playing him in cash this week. This 4th tier is where things get really interesting, and like I talked about at the top of the video, we really don't know the situation at this point with David Johnson or Todd Gurley. Both of them seem legitimately highly questionable, and if either of them were to sit, or both of them to sit, I think both of their backups come directly into play. Now, Chase Edmonds is 4,600. He's been, flirting with production, even with DJ in the lineup. Last week against the Bengals had 8 carries for 68 yards and a touchdown, 4 targets, 3 receptions for another 18 yards. He would be a stone lock against this terrible, terrible Falcons defense. If David Johnson were to miss, he would be completely out of play, in my opinion, if David Johnson were to play. So that is kind of why they're in this ambiguous tier. If we knew for certain that David Johnson would play, this would be a top tier play for me. And with Malcolm Brown, I think there's a little bit less certainty because, they've been talking up Henderson a little bit in the media, but I mean, we saw that Malcolm Brown is basically dominating all non-Gurley snaps. Henderson's been a non-factor. He could get factored in, if we're talking about a full game without Todd Gurley, which seems like a legit possibility. But I do think that at 4,300, Malcolm Brown is also squarely in play, in the event that Gurley sits. Now, this next tier is consisting of Leonard Fournette, a.k.a. Lenny, at 6,700, who has had an insane amount of usage. I don't really love the matchup against the Saints, but at home, he's coming off of, in week 4, a 200-yard rushing game. Last week, another 100 yards and a touchdown, 7 targets last week. I mean, he's been dominating. Great usage, great usage at 6,700. I definitely think that he is squarely in play. And Chris Carson as well, who I believe set a career high snap rate last week, or maybe it was a season high, but still, coming off of 2 straight games with over 20 touches. Last week had 27 for 118, 2 targets, and in week 4, again, he saw 4 targets, 4 receptions. So the thing with Carson is I don't know. He's on the road. Lev Bell and Kamara are both, going to be in my lineup before, and I'm praying that I can, get one of these other, value running backs, either Brown or Edmonds, preferably Edmonds, into that 3rd flex spot or running back spot, if you will, for DraftKings cash. So I don't want to play either of these 2 guys, but if Gurley and DJ both end up being fully healthy, I think that they are legitimately in play. And then finally, I don't want to say that Mark Ingram is not in play because, this matchup, it lines up well for him. He is top 3 in the NFL in running back touchdowns. The other 2 guys that are right up there with him, McCaffrey and Aaron Jones, aren't on the slate. So, in terms of touchdown expectation against this terrible, terrible Bengals team, I think that Mark Ingram is high. It's just that we know that touchdowns are less predictable than things like receptions and yardage. And when he's squarely priced in between Le'Veon Bell and Leonard Fournette, I just don't know if I could see myself going there. That being said, again, I mean, I don't know who has a higher touchdown expectation at running back on the board than Mark Ingram in this spot. So yeah, he is most likely not in play for me, but I don't want to say that I'm not considering him because, I am. And my boy Jared, who I do the DFS Dose podcast with, coming out every Friday, you can check that out, is really big on Ingram this week, and I'm going to, at least take that into account and give my boy a chance because, I mean, he's been great in cash this year. Shout out to you, Jared. So moving on to wide receiver here, I think Cooper Kupp is far and away the best play at the position on the board. He has been insanely consistent. 4 straight games over 20 points. His 7,100 price tag seems low to me, especially if Brandon Cooks were to miss this game. Now, I don't know if we're expecting Cooks to miss this game at this point. I think that'll become a little bit more clear later in the day today. So, keep an eye out for that. But I mean, Kupp is leading the NFL in targets by a pretty decent margin. He has had, just looking through his game log, 1 game under 10 targets, and that game was a 9-target game. Other than that, he's had 17 targets, 15 targets, 12 targets, 10 targets. It's just unbelievable. 4 straight games over 100 yards receiving. He's gotten 4 touchdowns in the last 3 weeks, and he's just been unbelievably consistent. And San Francisco is a tough defense, no doubt about it, but the entire Rams offense, it starts with Jared Goff, and then it obviously trickles down to his wide receivers, is more productive at home. And they have been for pretty much as long as this Goff-McVay, offense has been together. So at home, San Fran coming off of a shorter week, I think that we definitely, no doubt about it, have to consider Cooper Kupp in this spot. He's just flat out underpriced. I mean, we're talking about a guy here, if I could just pull it up real quick, who, like I said, is leading in targets. He's got 63 targets on the year, and he's cheaper than a guy like DeAndre Hopkins, who has 44 targets. It makes no sense to me whatsoever. I do think that if you can fit Cooper Kupp in there, I think that you absolutely have to, no doubt about it. And then, speaking of these Rams wide receivers, Robert Woods, who I've got in my second tier here, is, 5th in the NFL in targets right now. And he's only 5,600. Now, again, it's hard for me to pick between these two guys because the value you get by going Robert Woods is very significant. Okay, very significant. We're talking about a $1,500 discount. But again, it's just the way that Goff locks onto Kupp. It makes it so difficult to fade him. I'm expecting his ownership to be, insane. But that being said, I do think that Woods is an equally good play for all those same reasons. And again, I would expect a slight target boost for both of them if Cooks were to miss this game. The other guy here in my second tier is another player that I'm extremely excited to play this week, and I want to get him into damn near every lineup I can. So Tyler Boyd, he's averaging 10.6 targets per game. He has 53 on the year, more than double the next closest Bengals pass catcher, which is Auden Tate. The Ravens are bottom 5 in sacks. So Dalton should have a decently clean pocket, as good of a protection as you can have with the offensive line that the Bengals have. Granted, it is terrible, but, it'll be relatively clean, I think, this week. And the Ravens have been, terrible in the slot. They gave up 100 yards to Christian Kirk. They gave up 100 yards to Larry Fitzgerald, to Jarvis Landry. They gave up, 775 and 1 to Juju in the slot. And Tyler Boyd, runs over 60% of his routes in the slot. His target share is insane, and I think that he's an amazing play. 6,300 is way too cheap for a guy averaging 10.6 targets per game in a great matchup. So I love that play. Looking a little bit lower, and this is where things start to get shaky. I don't think that wide receiver is very deep this week for cash games. I do think that D.D. Westbrook is going to be a decent play. I don't love this game. I'm expecting this game to be rather slow-paced, but, Westbrook has been decent. Hasn't been great. Hasn't had, 16 points yet. He'll have, if you look at his game log and this 5,100 price tag, he'd have only 3x that one time so far this year. So I'm not sure. This is matchup based, and I never really like to put too much stock into matchups, but I do think that on the surface, Westbrook is a good play, and that the matchup just helps it. He's leading the Jags wide receivers and targets. I know that might be a little bit surprising. People probably expected that it would be Shark, but no. Westbrook is actually leading the team in targets. He is going to play in the slot against PJ Williams of the Saints, who is an absolute swinging door. He's just like, come on in. You need fantasy points? Let me have them. So Westbrook to me at 5,100 is the safest value play. I'll talk about these next two guys in a minute here, who I think are decent value plays, but I don't think that they have the same floor as Westbrook. Westbrook, I am fine with playing. I think that, DJ Chark is actually going to be relatively popular, especially after putting up 39 points last week. But he gets the Lattimore treatment and, has slightly less targets than Westbrook, whereas Westbrook gets the PJ Williams matchup in the slot that I do love to target, and I have for quite a while. So I do think that my lean here is Westbrook, especially in cash games. Now, these next two guys, Preston Williams and Jamison Crowder, right at 4.1K and 4K respectively. It's hard for me. It's a matchup thing with Preston. Playing a Dolphin period in cash seems shaky to me, but he has been the most targeted option in this offense, especially since Josh Rosen has taken over. He's got double-digit points in 3 out of 4 games. And this game is just going to be a competition to see which defense is more horrific. It's in home. Maybe Preston Williams bounces back. If you look at air yards and like the buy low model, for example, I know that he is popping on things like that. Jamison Crowder in the same tier, I think, has a higher target projection, at least in my opinion, with Darnold returning. We saw, Darnold to Crowder was an insane connection in week 1. The last time that we saw Sam Darnold, Crowder got 17 targets, 14 receptions. So to me, that is a little bit more appealing, than Preston Williams, who, yes, he does have one double-digit target game, 12 targets, but other than that, 5, 6, 7 targets, it's decent. But again, it would be hard to play Crowder with Le'Veon Bell and I think Jets defense both being squarely in play for cash games. I mean, how much Jets exposure do you really want in a given week? I already feel like two Jets pieces might already be too much, to be honest with you. And the Cowboys are by far a much better defense than Washington. So I think that maybe Williams gets a slight lean there. It's just like playing Preston Williams in cash is, it just gives me the shivers. I would rather not. And then this last tier of guys. Now, these are all players that I think are relatively decent cash plays, but it's just their salaries and the players around them make them, my bottom tier. Not that I think any of them are unequivocally bad plays, or, not that any of them are bad plays to say that, but it's just a little more difficult. Now, Odell Beckham has been slumping. He has not been living up to the expectation that I think a lot of people, if you play season long, you probably drafted him at the bottom of the first round, top of the second. And then you look at his last 3 games, 11.6 points, 4 points, 6 points. Like, that's not what you want to see. The Browns have been off, but Seattle's defense is not great, especially their pass defense. And I think that Odell and Baker come home and they bounce back in a big spot this week. I've seen that take floated around, and I agree with it. I do want to be cautious of what this ownership is before we attack it in tournaments, but in cash games, I do think, Odell is tied for 9th in targets in the league still. I do think that the bounce back is coming. I just don't know if we can go there in cash when, for example, Tyler Boyd is $500 cheaper and Cooper Kupp is only $300 more expensive. So that's why he's ranked so low. And that's the same thing with Adam Thielen. Adam Thielen hasn't seen more than 8 targets and he's got 5 touchdowns on the year. When such a high percentage of your points are coming from your touchdowns, I would just rather chase the guys who are being more productive in terms of yardage and targets, because I think that's easier to bank on for cash games. That being said, Minnesota at home against this terrible, terrible Philly secondary. I mean, you have to consider Thielen. He's really the only pass catcher with any sort of consistent role for the Vikings. But, if the Vikings get their wish, they won't have to pass, hardly at all. So we know that that's how they want to play, which I think, in terms of pace, in terms of just scoring environment, I'm not crazy about this Vikings game at all. And then lastly, Michael Gallup, who, was coming off of an injury last week, and I think that we saw his role be a little bit boosted from the fact that they had to throw so much. They were down, the Cowboys were down to the Packers pretty much from jump, and, Gallup saw 14 targets, 7 receptions for 113 and a touch. I mean, Gallup has been consistent when he has been in there. He's played 3 games, hasn't had less than 6 catches. He seems to be fully healthy. His deep, A dot is going to raise his not raise his floor. It's going to raise his ceiling. And it's going to make him a, enticing target at 5,600. I think he could definitely snap against this terrible Jets defense. It's just a matter of, he's the same price as Robert Woods, and he's not as good of a play as Robert Woods. I'd prefer him to somebody like Chark this week, though. I will definitely say that. Looking over at tight end, I think that there is a clear top tier, and both of them are within $200 of one another, so I think that makes for a really interesting choice, and that's going to be between Austin Hooper and George Kittle. Now, on Thursday morning, my lean is Kittle, and I'll talk about that in a second, but by no means am I disregarding Austin Hooper. We know he's in the nut matchup against Arizona, and, for me as a DFS player, I incorporate matchup into my process, but I think I do so less than a lot of other people. For me, I need your workload. I need everything else about you to make you a good play, and then the matchup is sort of like, okay, well, that helps then. But, as far as Hooper goes, he's had 9 targets, an average of 9 targets over the last 3 games. He is in a great spot, like we said, against Arizona. This team should see an uptick in pace in terms of plays ran, and, I think Hooper will benefit from that. He's been very consistent at 5K, but I do think that seeing George Kittle at 5,200 is a little bit jarring, and when you look at his last 3 games, he plays the Rams twice a year, so we have a decent sample size of him against this defense specifically. 33.9 DK points, 21.8 DK points, and 17 DK points, and his price just doesn't make sense to me. I mean, I understand that all the tight ends sub Kelsey are well under 6K, and I know that George Kittle has been slow to start the year, but I just think that we might be overvaluing a small sample size, and Kittle at 5,200, who is dominating in terms of targets for the 49ers, and finally got off the touchdown Schneid scoring last week against Cleveland, now comes to a team that he's had a very consistent record of production against. I do think that Kittle at 5,200 is vastly underpriced, and he is my top play this week. That being said, he's right there with Hooper, so I wouldn't really, disagree with you for picking either of those guys. I just want to be on record early in the week at least and say that I think Kittle is where I will be most likely looking. Travis Kelce is in tier 3. Don't really have to say too much about that. Kelce is uber consistent. He is the best tight end in the NFL, and he's going to be in a great scoring environment. He's the best pure play on the board, but he is in my second tier just based on price. I don't think that you can get up there, and I don't think that you should, to be honest, with the $1,800 discount you can get by going down to Kittle or a full 2K to go down to Hooper. I don't think that, Kelce is a 2K better play than either of these guys. So, he's a great play. Love him for tournaments, especially if we can get that ownership discount. But I do prefer Kittle and Hooper this week. Where it gets interesting for tight end, in my opinion, is if you pay down. Because now we're talking about freeing up some space for some of these other elite plays, and that's Gerald Everett. Now, to me, I think Brandon Cooks sitting would make this a better play. But even if Cooks plays, I mean, Gerald Everett has been legitimately good. I think that his talent has always been sort of looked over. He's been always kind of splitting with Higbee in this offense, but over the past 2 weeks especially, he's third in routes ran by tight end in the NFL. And, if Cooks is to miss, those targets have to go somewhere. They're not all going to go to, Woods and Cooks. And yeah, Reynolds has been a wide receiver who steps in at points, but, Reynolds makes more sense stepping in for guys like, Kupp or somebody like Woods even. But, he's not the same type of player as Brandon Cooks. He's not going to be running these deep routes the way that Brandon Cooks does. I think that in general, if Cooks are to sit, there's going to be a lot, shorter average depth of target in this game. And I think somebody like Everett, who has seen, quietly 19 targets over the last 2 weeks. And like I said, with the routes ran thing, I really like him at 3,600. I think that he frees up a lot in terms of roster construction. Might be tough to go there over guys like Kittle and Hooper, but he is squarely in play for me at 3,600. I think the discount is well worth it. So, we'll see how lineup construction shakes out. I like that there's a cheap option that I feel good about this week at tight end. And then finally, defense. We don't really have to talk too much about this. My policy with defense is usually you just scroll down, keep going. You find the lowest home defense, check their sack rate, their pressure rate, DVOA, all that. If it isn't too insane, just roll. We call it the scroll and roll on the DFS Dose podcast. It's been a very profitable strategy in terms of DraftKings. Now, get to scroll for a while this week because they dropped the floor out of defensive pricing. We've got 3 defenses under 2K, and I would play any of them. Probably would be less likely to play the Bengals because they get no pressure whatsoever, like I talked about at the top of this video when I spoke about Lamar Jackson, and they're on the road. But, the Jets, top 10 DVOA, at home, 1,500, which frees up a ton for your roster. So, the Jets are a great play, I think, this week in terms of a DST. I don't mind the Cardinals at home either. I think that, they're a little bit worse than the Jets in terms of their defense, and they're definitely, I can't say that Atlanta's a better offense than Dallas. They're actually not whatsoever. But, I don't know. I like the Jets a little bit more. I think that if you're going to pay all the way down, you might as well just pay all the way down. And, the Jets have been averaging 10.8 fantasy points per game. At this 1.5K salary, they would have 3x'd in at least 3 of their 4 games up to this point. So I just think that you can just really roll with the Jets this week. If you don't go with the Jets or the Cardinals here, I kind of like the 49ers if you are fading, these Rams players. And even if you're not, their defensive front is just absolutely insane. Their sack rate, their pressure rate, just everything about this 49ers defense, they're super legit. And at only 2,700, I do think that they stand out for sure as a play this week. I wish they were home. And coming off of a short week, I think definitively does put them in the second tier here below these 2 cheaper options. For cash, I don't see any reason to go above 2K in week 6 on DraftKings. But thank you guys for watching. That is going to be it for this video. Like I said at the top, please feel free to follow me on Twitter. Check out the updated rankings. I'll incorporate everything from, the David Johnson and Todd Gurley injury to any other late news that we get eventually, throughout the week. So, keep your eyes peeled for that. And let's get some money this week, guys. I'm ready. I was feeling last week. It was an insane week for cash games. And I think we'll be a little bit more in the regular, 150, 160 range in terms of points this week. But even so, we're going to get there and we're going to make some money, and these tiers are going to help us do it. So we will see you guys next week, and make sure you check out the DFS Dose podcast as well. We'll be recording that later tonight to be released on Friday. So thank you guys, and see you next week.